Hi guys, tonight let's sink slowly, as though drifting on a quiet river, into a story that is not quite a story but a wandering journey through time. We'll whisper our way back to the medieval world, where courtly gestures and hushed promises shaped what we might call dating, though the word itself didn't yet exist. Imagine the dim glow of firelight in a stone hall, the rustle of wool garments, the soft clink of goblets. This will not be a tale of wars or kings. No, it will be about the tender rituals of affection, the ordinary lives that unfolded quietly between the great battles and decrees. Over the course of 20 parts, each one lingering like a candle burning down slowly, we will drift through the nuances of medieval love, the customs, the silences, and the little details that history books often leave untouched. Think of this not as a lecture, but as a lullaby meant to soothe your thoughts into stillness. In the medieval centuries, affection was less about freedom and more about obligation. Marriages were contracts, alliances, and strategies. Yet behind the formality there existed stolen glances, folded letters, and even poetry exchanged in secret. If you close your eyes, you might picture a nobleman in his tunic, nervously approaching a lady with carefully chosen words that had been rehearsed again and again. He was not free to say all he felt, for words could travel quickly and ruin reputations. Love then was cautious, often hidden, but powerful in its secrecy. Now, before we walk too far into candlelit halls, let us begin slowly, gently, by setting the scene of this world. The medieval period stretched from the 5th to the 15th century, 1,000 years of shifting cultures, of knights and castles, of villages in muddy lanes, and of monasteries that rang with chants at dawn. But within that 1,000 years, the way men and women looked at each other, the ways they met and courted, were varied and fascinating. Dating as we know it is modern. But courting was something else entirely, wrapped in rules, rituals, and gestures that could mean more than entire conversations. Imagine a crowded feast, tables groaning with bread and meat, minstrels playing softly near the hearth. At such events, nobles might exchange brief interactions, a touch when passing a cup, a smile quickly hidden behind lowered lashes. These were signals, often subtle enough to be missed by outsiders, but powerful enough to stir entire lifetimes of feeling. To us it may feel agonizingly slow, but to them every second mattered. The weight of propriety and honor pressed down upon love like a heavy cloak, forcing it to glow quietly in small corners. For peasants, the scene was different. Their lives were simpler, harsher, and more practical. A man might show interest by helping a woman with the harvest, or by offering her a small carved trinket, perhaps a wooden comb or a crude necklace. Words of affection were fewer, but gestures, helping lift a bucket, sharing food, carried an unmistakable meaning. In villages, whispers of love were exchanged over bread ovens and in the shade of barns. There was little privacy, but also little pretense. Marriage for them was necessity, a way to share labor, survive winters, and raise children who would help in the fields. But necessity did not exclude tenderness. It only shaped it differently. Courtly love, however, belongs to the realm of poetry, of troubadours who carried songs from castle to castle. These songs spoke of knights who pledged themselves to ladies, often unattainable ones, sometimes even married ones. Such love was almost theatrical, exaggerated, wrapped in layers of metaphor. But it fueled the imagination of the age. It told people that love was noble, that yearning itself was a kind of virtue. These ideas fluttered through the corridors of castles like sparrows, never quite landing, but always present. Yet in all these settings, one thread remained the same. Love was rarely simple. It was watched, guarded, restrained. A wrong move could stain a family's honor. A misstep could ruin futures. So people learned to speak in gestures, to write carefully, to hide their true feelings in the folds of poetry or in the secrecy of a garden meeting. The heart was often louder than the voice, and that, perhaps, made emotions even more intense. Think of the letters. Some of them survive, brittle with age, words faded but still speaking across centuries. They are not fiery declarations, but measured, careful lines. I hold you in my thoughts, or your kindness gives me joy. These were the kinds of phrases that kept affection alive in an age when public displays were nearly impossible. Paper and ink were precious, so words were chosen with immense care. Every stroke of the quill mattered. To send such a letter was both an act of courage and a risk. If intercepted, it could spell disaster, but if received, it could keep two hearts bound across distance and silence. Now let us linger for a while on one quiet evening in a medieval town. The market has long closed, and the lamps along the narrow street burn dimly. In a small wooden house, a young woman waits at the door. Her suitor, a craftsman, has promised to visit. He carries with him not jewels, but a loaf of bread he baked himself. She accepts it, smiling softly, and their conversation is brief, for her parents are nearby. Yet in that simple gift, in the act of offering something made by his own hands, a bond begins to form. There is nothing spectacular here, no knight, no ballad, but there is love, quiet and real, shaped by the rhythms of ordinary life. As we drift deeper into this world, you might notice how different it feels from our modern idea of dating. There were no dinners in restaurants, no letters sent with emojis, no photographs exchanged. Instead, there was patience, long waiting, and the art of reading between the lines. The medieval heart had to be clever. It had to survive in an age where feelings were not free, but bound tightly by family, church, and tradition. And yet, despite all that, love still grew, still found its way, like ivy climbing even the coldest stone walls. This is where our journey begins. A world where silence spoke volumes, where gestures could mean everything, and where the faintest smile could change a destiny. It may feel slow, but that slowness has its own charm. Tonight, we've only set the stage, lit the candles, and opened the first door. Ahead, we will wander through troubadour songs, village fairs, wedding rituals, and even the forbidden loves that risked it all. But for now, let us pause. Let the images linger softly in your mind, and let the hush of medieval nights guide you toward rest. If we lean closer into the shadows of the medieval world, we begin to see not only the grandeur of castles and knights, but the soft rhythm of everyday life, where affection had to weave its way gently between duties, expectations, and traditions. Part 2 of our wandering journey takes us into the world of the troubadours, the poets and singers who carried words of longing across the hills of France, Italy, and beyond. Their voices were the threads that stitched together a vision of love, not always real, but always captivating, painting a picture of passion so refined that even centuries later we can feel its lingering echo. The troubadour tradition began in the courts of southern France during the 11th century, blossoming like wildflowers in fields otherwise heavy with war and politics. These were not knights nor peasants, but poets who devoted themselves to the art of expressing love as if it were the noblest of human endeavours. They sang not of duty or alliance, but of admiration, yearning, and the exquisite pain of distance. Often, the love they described was unattainable, focused on a lady who was already married, often to a man of higher rank. Yet it was precisely this distance that gave their words such power. For to long for what one could not have was, in their eyes, the truest form of devotion. Imagine the scene, a small gathering within a castle hall, flickering light spilling from torches onto tapestries. The lady sits high, dignified, surrounded by companions. The troubadour begins his song, plucking softly at a lute, his voice low and steady. The words, veiled in metaphor, are directed to her, though spoken as if for all. He cannot name her, propriety forbids it, but she knows. Her heart recognizes itself in his verses. And though she may never respond openly, the recognition is enough. A bond has been formed, secret but profound. This is what they called fin amour, refined love, love purified by its own impossibility. For the people who listened, these songs were more than entertainment. They were lessons in how to feel, how to express, how to dream of something greater than duty. They elevated love into a philosophy, suggesting that to adore someone was not weakness but strength, a path toward virtue. The knight who rode into battle wearing his lady's token, a scarf or ribbon tied to his arm, was not simply showing loyalty. He was embodying this new idea that love could ennoble, could make one braver, purer, better. This was not marriage as contract, but love as inspiration. Yet outside the halls of nobility, the echoes of troubadour songs still reached the ears of ordinary people. Minstrels carried them into villages, adapting the words for simpler audiences. A farmer might hum a softened version while working, or a young girl might whisper a line to herself in the fields, dreaming of romance beyond her daily chores. In this way, the idea of courtly love seeped slowly into the fabric of medieval life. even among those who could not afford grand gestures or poetic declarations. It gave shape to feelings that might otherwise have remained nameless, and in doing so, it offered a quiet escape from the weight of survival. But let us not imagine that this world was free of contradiction. The church often looked upon troubadours with suspicion, warning that their songs encouraged sin, adultery, and distraction from holy duties. Priests reminded their congregations that true love should be directed toward God, not toward earthly passions. Yet even with such warnings, the songs persisted, as though hearts were unwilling to be silenced. The tension between faith and desire became part of the very texture of medieval love, shaping it into something at once fragile and defiant. To love, in this sense, was almost an act of quiet rebellion. Picture, for a moment, a young knight who has heard these songs and carries them in his heart. He serves his lord faithfully, trains with sword and shield, but in the silence of his chamber he writes verses on scraps of parchment. His words are clumsy, lacking the polish of troubadour masters, but they are sincere. He addresses them to a woman he can never claim, perhaps the daughter of a baron or the wife of a fellow knight. He hides the scraps away, fearing discovery, but the act of writing gives him strength. The unspoken love fuels his courage on the battlefield, where he fights with a fervour born not of politics but of something far more personal. This is the quiet power of the troubadour spirit. It gave even the smallest voice the courage to feel deeply. And in the countryside, where castles were only distant silhouettes on the horizon, the rhythms of romance were far simpler. Yet even here, the influence of noble ideals trickled down. Young men carved wooden hearts for the women they admired, or scratched initials into the bark of trees. They may not have sung elaborate ballads, but they found their own ways to imitate the gestures of courtly love. Sometimes, when minstrels passed through their villages, they would carry away fragments of melodies, weaving them into their own stories. In this way, the grand tradition of noble poetry became something shared, reshaped by the hands of farmers, shepherds, and artisans. As the centuries passed, the language of love grew more layered. Love was no longer just survival, or alliance, or duty. It became an art form, something people were encouraged to refine, to cultivate, as though it were a garden requiring careful tending. The troubadours had planted the seeds, and slowly, across fields and towns, those seeds began to bloom. To court someone became not only a matter of practicality, but a performance, a careful dance of words and gestures that spoke both of desire and of restraint. Yet for all its beauty, this world of songs and sighs could also be bittersweet. For many, love remained unfulfilled, a dream admired from afar but never touched. The troubadours themselves often described love as suffering, as sweet pain, as longing without resolution. And perhaps this was part of its power. To desire without possessing kept the flame alive, untainted by the complexities of daily life. It was, in its way, a safe kind of love, forever suspended in possibility, never collapsing under the weight of reality. As we let these images settle softly in the mind, it becomes clear that medieval dating, or more truly, medieval courting, was not one thing but many. For nobles it was poetry and performance. For peasants it was gestures and necessity. For all, it was constrained, hidden, and shaped by the ever-present gaze of society and church. Yet within these constraints, there bloomed something delicate, fragile, and enduring. Love found ways to survive, to express itself, even in silence. And in that quiet persistence, we begin to see how even in the strictest times, the human heart remained stubbornly free. If we drift further into the heart of medieval life, past the echoes of troubadours and the whispered songs of noble courts, we find ourselves standing at the very threshold of one of the most important rituals in the age: marriage. Unlike the fleeting verses of poets or the stolen glances across banquet halls, marriage was the anchor of medieval society. It was not, in most cases, the culmination of a romantic journey. Instead, it was a practical arrangement, forged in the fires of necessity, politics, or survival. To understand what dating, or rather courting, meant in this world, we must first step into the weighty structure of medieval marriage, for it framed every interaction, every possibility, and every dream of love. Picture a grand hall where two families meet. The young bride, perhaps no older than 15, stands quietly beside her parents. The groom, sometimes much older, arrives with his kin, each side eyeing the other with calculated interest. This is not a gathering of hearts, but of households. Land, dowry, alliances, and inheritance hover in the air like invisible presences. The marriage contract is read aloud, a document more concerned with property and power than with affection. The girl, her eyes lowered, might not even know the man she is to wed. In such halls, love is a faint whisper, nearly drowned out by the clamour of duty. Yet even here, beneath the heavy weight of obligation, human feeling found cracks through which it could seep. Some couples, though bound by arrangement, grew to love each other in time. Affection could blossom slowly, like ivy crawling over cold stone walls, patient and enduring. They shared bread, endured winters, raised children, and in that quiet partnership, fondness often rooted itself deeply. But just as often, love had no place in these unions, and hearts wandered elsewhere, toward forbidden desires whispered in the language of courtly love. For peasants, marriage was both simpler and more pressing. It was a matter of survival. A man and woman joined their lives to share work, to raise children who would become helping hands, to ensure food could be grown, harvested, and stored. There were no troubadour songs here, no elaborate rituals. A small gathering might be held, perhaps in the presence of a priest, with bread and ale shared afterward among family and neighbours. Yet for all its simplicity, the bonds of these marriages were often strong. Shared labour created shared lives. A husband and wife, who spent long days in the fields or tending animals, knew each other's strengths and weariness intimately. Love, in this setting, was not an abstract ideal, but a practical tenderness, the passing of a cup of water, the mending of a shirt, the quiet support during illness or famine. Still, even in these villages, the church held sway. By the 12th century, the church had asserted its authority over marriage, declaring it a holy sacrament rather than just a private arrangement. Priests reminded couples that their union was not merely for themselves, but for God, for family, and for the order of society. Consent became a matter of doctrine, though in practice, parental approval and family interests often outweighed individual choice. Yet the very idea that a couple must consent planted seeds of autonomy, fragile though they were, in the stony soil of medieval tradition. And so courtship, such as it was, took shape within these boundaries. For nobles, it meant negotiations carried out by families, dowries calculated, lands exchanged. For commoners, it was a quieter process. Conversations at markets, meetings at festivals, the watchful eyes of neighbours ensuring propriety. A young man might linger near the well where a woman fetched water, offering to carry her bucket. A young woman might bake an extra loaf of bread to share. These gestures, small but significant, were the language of affection in a world where words carried risks and futures were already mapped out by necessity. But alongside this practicality, the culture of courtly love introduced an element of dreaming. Even for those whose marriages were arranged or whose unions were grounded in survival, the songs and stories of the age offered a kind of escape. Tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, of Tristan and Isolde, of knights who risked everything for love, these were not just idle entertainments. They were windows into another possibility, however distant. They whispered of passion, of risk, of love so great it defied all reason. And though most would never act upon such dreams, the very act of imagining them gave life a different hue, a secret palette of emotions beneath the grey tones of daily duty. Imagine, then, a medieval village festival, where music and dancing filled the square. For one night, roles loosened and young men and women could mingle more freely, laughing, exchanging glances under the watchful stars. Parents still observed, neighbours still gossiped, but in the rhythm of drums and the spin of a dance, something of freedom entered the air. Here, perhaps, the beginnings of affection could take root. A shared dance could lead to more conversations, and over time, to a marriage that, though shaped by practicality, carried within it the spark of choice. In these moments, love and necessity danced together, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully. It is worth remembering that the medieval world was not uniform. Customs varied across regions, cultures, and centuries. In some places, women had more say in their unions. In others, they were mere pawns in the chess game of alliances. In some villages, traditions allowed for playful courting rituals, such as singing beneath windows or leaving small gifts. In others, formality ruled with a stern hand. Yet everywhere, beneath these variations, one truth remained. The human heart beat with the same restless rhythm, yearning for connection, even when bound by duty. And so, medieval dating, if we dare call it that, was not about freedom of choice, nor about long searches for the perfect partner. It was about moving carefully within the frameworks given, about finding tenderness in a world where love was not always expected. And yet it was also about yearning beyond those frameworks, dreaming of something more, carried on the wings of songs and stories. The tension between duty and desire defined the very shape of medieval affection. To live in that age was to navigate both, to seek warmth in arranged unions while secretly cherishing the idea of love as the troubadours sang it, pure, noble, and endlessly out of reach. In this quiet balancing act we see the essence of medieval life itself. Practicality and poetry, survival and dreaming, side by side, never fully reconciled but always intertwined. Love in the medieval sense was both everywhere and nowhere, hidden in gestures, carried in songs, and framed by duty. It was a whisper in the noise of daily life, fragile yet enduring, like the glow of embers that refused to fade even in the coldest night. As we step deeper into the medieval landscape, we begin to notice how love and courting were not only shaped by families and traditions, but also by the rules of chivalry. Chivalry was more than a code of combat. It was a way of life, a set of ideals that governed how knights should act, not only in battle but in court, in love and in faith. It draped romance in a kind of armor, blending valor with gentleness, courage with restraint. If troubadours gave love its poetry, then chivalry gave it its stage, turning simple affections into acts of honor and duty. Picture a knight preparing for a tournament. He polishes his armor until it glows in the sun, straps on his sword and mounts his horse. Yet before he enters the lists to tilt with his lance, he receives a token, a ribbon, a glove, perhaps even a handkerchief from the lady he serves. This gesture, small but profound, transforms his fight into more than a contest of strength. It becomes an offering, a performance dedicated to her. He rides not only for himself, nor even for his lord, but for the ideal of love, wrapped in the silken cloth tied to his arm. The crowd cheers his skill, but beneath the roar, there is a private conversation taking place, carried on in glances and in the silent language of loyalty. This idea that love could inspire bravery was central to the medieval imagination. A knight who fought for love was believed to be stronger, purer, more devoted. The lady he served, often unattainable, embodied an ideal that lifted him above mere survival. She was not always his wife or betrothed. Sometimes she was a married noblewoman, sometimes even far above his station. But that distance was part of the power. To love without expectation, to serve without reward, was considered the noblest kind of devotion. It was not possession that mattered, but dedication. Yet behind the glitter of tournaments and the high ideals of chivalry, the realities of affection remained more complex. A knight's loyalty to his lady could be genuine, but it could also be political, a display meant to strengthen alliances or gain favour at court. A lady, in turn, might encourage a knight's devotion, not out of passion, but as a way to secure her own influence. These layers of meaning meant that medieval courtship was never just about two hearts. It was about families, politics, reputation, and survival. Every word spoken, every gesture made, carried echoes beyond the immediate moment, rippling outward into the delicate web of society. Still, chivalric love held a strange kind of magic. It gave people permission to imagine love as something transformative, something capable of elevating both man and woman. It told stories of knights who grew stronger through devotion, and of ladies who inspired greatness through their mere presence. These were not love stories in the modern sense, with happy endings and mutual fulfillment. They were stories of longing, of sacrifice, of yearning for something higher than the ordinary. And though such tales were idealized, they offered a lens through which people could understand their own quiet affections. Think of a young squire, watching the knights with awe, dreaming of the day he too will ride into battle wearing a lady's favour. He may not yet know the true burdens of such devotion, but in his heart the dream burns brightly. He sharpens his sword and learns his lessons, believing that love will one day make him braver, nobler, more complete. His heart stirs not only with desire but with aspiration, a longing to embody the very ideals sung in the troubadour's verses and whispered through the corridors of castles. But not all were swept away by these ideals. Some saw them as dangerous illusions, distractions from the realities of marriage, family, and faith. Clerics often warned against courtly love, declaring it a temptation that could lead to sin. To yearn for another man's wife, to place devotion to a mortal woman above devotion to God, was, in their eyes, a perilous path. Yet even as sermons thundered against it, the ideals of chivalric love persisted, slipping into stories, songs, and daily life, like a melody that refused to be silenced. For women, too, chivalry was both empowering and constraining. To be the object of a knight's devotion gave a lady a kind of influence she might not otherwise possess. Her smile could embolden him, her disfavour could wound him more deeply than any sword. Yet she was also bound by rules, expected to remain distant, aloof, untouchable. To respond too freely could risk her reputation, her family's honour, even her safety. And so, much like the knights who longed for them, ladies learned to navigate love with subtlety, balancing admiration with restraint, longing with decorum. Outside the noble courts, echoes of chivalric ideals trickled into festivals and village traditions. Games of mock combat, dances where young men carried small tokens from women they admired, or stories told around the fire, all these reflected the distant shimmer of chivalric love. Though peasants did not live by the code of knights, they absorbed its images and wove them into their own simpler rituals of courtship. Even the smallest village could be touched by the grandeur of an idea too powerful to remain confined within castle walls. And so, medieval dating, if we still call it that, was steeped in chivalry, wrapped in layers of meaning that were as much performance as reality. Love was not only a private feeling, but a public act, a display of loyalty, courage, and honour. It was woven into tournaments, into poetry, into gestures both grand and small. And yet, beneath the armour and ceremony, it remained fragile, uncertain, often unfulfilled. Longing was more common than union, and admiration more common than intimacy. Still, the dream persisted. To love in the age of chivalry was to reach beyond oneself, to imagine affection not as possession but as transformation. It was to believe that love could make one stronger, braver, more noble. And even if the reality often fell short of the dream itself was enough to give meaning to countless lives, carrying them through the long centuries with the quiet fire of devotion burning just beneath the surface. If we wander now from the glitter of tournaments and the polished codes of chivalry, we begin to notice the quieter spaces where medieval affection unfolded. The gardens, the feasts, and the festivals where men and women could, if only for a moment, step beyond duty and glimpse something closer to choice. These were the occasions when love revealed itself not in the clash of lances or the soaring verses of poets, but in the everyday rhythms of shared gatherings, in laughter, in music, and in the gentle rituals of communal life. Imagine a castle garden in spring, its hedges trimmed into careful patterns, its fountains trickling softly. Such gardens were not merely places of beauty, they were stages where the language of courtship played out with subtle grace. Noble ladies strolled with their attendants, veils drifting in the breeze, while young knights or courtiers lingered nearby, waiting for a chance word, a fleeting glance. A stroll in the garden could carry layers of meaning. Proximity itself suggested interest, a carefully chosen compliment hinted at admiration, and the gift of a flower plucked from the path spoke volumes. These were not reckless acts, but deliberate ones, carefully performed under the watchful eyes of companions. Every move was weighed, every word cloaked in politeness, for the boundaries of propriety pressed closely in these settings. Yet within those boundaries, hearts found room to whisper to each other without sound. Festivals, however, opened other doors. When the seasons turned and the harvest was gathered, villages filled with music, dancing, and games. For peasants, such gatherings were precious, for they offered one of the few opportunities for men and women to meet beyond the gaze of family. Picture a square filled with laughter, with couples joining hands in circle dances that wound like ribbons through the night. The dance itself became a courtship ritual. A man might seek to hold a particular woman's hand, even if only for the length of a song. A smile exchanged in that moment could be the beginning of conversations that continued long after the music faded. In the swirl of motion, in the blur of torches and stars, love found space to take its first uncertain steps. Feasts, too, carried their own rituals of affection, though often hidden beneath layers of etiquette. In noble halls, banquets stretched long into the night, tables heavy with roasted meats, breads, and flagons of wine. Seating arrangements themselves could hint at alliances or interests, with lords and ladies placed strategically close, or carefully apart. A knight who served a lady a cup of wine, or who delicately offered her a morsel, enacted a gesture that seemed small but could resonate with quiet meaning. Such acts, though public, were veiled in courtesy, and so escaped censure while carrying private significance. A nobleman's glance across the table, a lady's lowered gaze in response, these became the silent sentences of medieval courting, a dialogue carried out beneath the surface of communal ritual. For common folk, the feast was more rustic but no less meaningful. After a long day's harvest or during a holy celebration, neighbours gathered in barns or open fields, their tables spread with simple fare. Ale was poured, bread broken, and songs lifted into the air. In this setting, courtship was often more direct, though still constrained by community expectations. A young man might carve a small gift for the woman he admired, presenting it beneath the noise of the gathering. A young woman, in turn, might show her favour by offering him a special portion of food or saving him a place at her side. These exchanges, modest though they were, carried deep weight, for they unfolded in a world where resources were scarce and gestures of sharing meant survival as much as affection. It is worth lingering, too, on the role of music in these gatherings. Whether the refined melodies of lutes in noble courts or the rougher tunes of fiddles in village festivals, music created a rhythm in which affection could breathe. Songs themselves often carried tales of love, sometimes tragic, sometimes playful. Listeners absorbed these stories, weaving them into their own lives. A woman might hear of a lady courted by a brave knight and feel her own heart stir. A man might hear of a shepherd's devotion and resolve to show his care more openly. Music was both mirror and inspiration, reflecting and shaping how people understood their emotions. But beyond music and feasting, there were playful games of courtship, rituals that allowed young people to test the waters of affection without the heavy weight of commitment. In some villages, traditions existed where young men left small tokens, branches, flowers, or decorated sticks at the doors of the women they admired. In others, women would respond with gifts of food or cloth, signalling acceptance or refusal. These exchanges were carried out under the eyes of neighbours who watched closely, gossiping and interpreting every move. In such communities, love was never entirely private. It was a thread woven into the larger fabric of village life, where every union mattered to all. In noble settings, the games were more formal, but just as layered with meaning. A lady might challenge her knight to prove his devotion through a quest, a hunt, or a feat of skill. He, in turn, would dedicate his efforts to her, proclaiming his loyalty through action rather than words. These challenges were rarely about the practical outcome. They were symbolic performances, shaping love into a ritual of honour and devotion. Yet even as they played out on grand stages, they were as fragile as the dances of peasants beneath torchlight, both bound by the same uncertainty, the quiet, unspoken question of whether affection might truly grow. And within all these settings, gardens, feasts, festivals, games, the tension between freedom and duty was ever present. A glance could be daring, a gift could be bold, a word could carry risk. Every gesture of affection had to be weighed against reputation, family, and expectation. And yet, perhaps because of these limits, each moment carried a depth that we, in our freer age, can hardly imagine. To hold a hand in a dance was not a casual act. It was an opening, a possibility, a risk. To exchange a smile across a table was to step into dangerous territory, for whispers could travel fast, and futures could shift with alarming speed. Still, people continued to reach for each other. Whether noble or peasant, whether in the grandeur of a castle garden or the noise of a village square, men and women found ways to express what could not always be spoken. Love, fragile yet persistent, found cracks in the walls of custom and tradition, slipping through in the laughter of a feast, in the rhythm of a dance, in the quiet gift of a flower placed into waiting hands. It was never simple, Never free, but it was always present, weaving itself into the very fabric of medieval life. If we turn our attention now from the bustling feasts and playful festivals, we begin to hear another, quieter voice shaping the rhythms of medieval love, the voice of the Church. To live in the Middle Ages was to live under the long shadow of religion, where nearly every aspect of life, from the cradle to the grave, was touched by faith. Courtship and marriage were no exceptions. If troubadours filled the air with songs of longing and knights raised banners of devotion in tournaments, the Church reminded men and women that their hearts belonged first to God. And so affection in this world was always balanced on a delicate edge between desire and doctrine. By the 12th century, the Church had claimed marriage not just as a social contract, but as a holy sacrament. It was no longer enough for two families to strike an agreement. Their union needed the blessing of a priest, spoken beneath the gaze of heaven. This sanctity added weight to the ritual, but it also tightened the boundaries around love. What might have been seen as private affection now became a matter of morality. To stray outside the accepted path was not only to risk reputation, but to risk the soul. The words of priests echoed through stone churches, reminding young men and women that passion was fleeting, but salvation eternal. And yet, even within this framework, the Church offered its own vision of love. Marriage was to be built not only on alliance, but on companionship, mutual support, and the raising of children in the faith. Sermons spoke of the bond between man and wife as a reflection of the bond between Christ and the Church, a sacred union of loyalty and sacrifice. In this sense, love was elevated, given a place of dignity, woven into the divine order itself. Couples who approached their union with reverence could find not only stability, but a sense of holiness in their bond. Still, the Church's stance was often at odds with the ideals of courtly love. Where troubadours praised longing for unattainable women, priests condemned it as temptation. Where knights declared devotion through gestures of passion, the Church warned against lust, urging restraint and moderation. Love outside marriage, whether whispered in gardens or sung in poetic verse, was painted as sin, dangerous to both body and soul. This tension created a double world in which medieval men and women lived, one shaped by the soaring ideals of poets and knights, and another defined by the stern warnings of faith. Confessionals became a quiet stage for this conflict. A young man, perhaps stirred by feelings he could not entirely hide, might kneel before his priest, whispering his secret thoughts. A woman, torn between duty and desire, might seek absolution for feelings she had never acted upon. The Church listened, admonished, forgave, but always reminded its flock that love must serve God's design, not personal longing. In these hushed moments, affection itself became a kind of moral trial, weighed against eternal consequences. And yet, human hearts are not so easily silenced. For every stern homily, there were lovers who found ways to meet in secret, slipping into gardens after dark, or exchanging letters hidden within books of prayer. These unions, forbidden by the Church, carried both danger and allure. The very act of defiance gave them intensity, turning ordinary affection into something that felt profound, even fated. To love under the threat of sin was to live at the edge of both passion and peril, a tension that burned brightly even in the silence of cloisters and chapels. But it would be unfair to imagine the Church as only a force of restriction. It also provided space for affection to be expressed within the safety of sanctified marriage. Weddings were not merely contracts. They became celebrations, blessed by priests, witnessed by communities, and marked by ritual. The exchange of vows, the blessing of rings, the joining of hands, these acts gave shape to love, binding it within the walls of faith. For many, this sanctity offered comfort, a reassurance that their union was not just practical, but holy. Consider, for instance, the rituals of betrothal, often carried out in the presence of clergy. A couple declared their intent to wed, sometimes months or even years before the actual ceremony. These promises, blessed by the Church, carried great weight, making broken engagements a serious matter. In this period between betrothal and marriage, couples might begin to know each other better, their interactions watched carefully by family and priest alike. This liminal space, caught between promise and fulfillment, allowed affection to grow cautiously, guarded but real. The church also shaped the language of love in more subtle ways. Monks and nuns devoted to lives of celibacy wrote treatises and sermons that described love in spiritual terms. Love of God, love of virtue, love of purity. Yet the metaphors they used often drew from earthly experiences of affection, blurring the boundary between divine and human. Mystical writings compared the soul's longing for God to a lover's yearning, creating a poetic bridge between passion and piety. In these texts, desire itself was not condemned but redirected, transformed into a longing for the divine. Such ideas filtered into wider culture, reshaping how people thought of both love and faith. And so, in the medieval world, love was never just private. It was entwined with belief, monitored by priests, blessed in rituals, and weighed against the eternal. For some, this brought peace, anchoring their affections in the sacred. For others, it brought conflict, forcing them to conceal what they felt or to wrestle with guilt. Yet, for all the restrictions, love endured. It found room to breathe even beneath the vaulted ceilings of churches, in the quiet exchanges of betrothal, in the sacred vows spoken at the altar. This tension between faith and feeling, between doctrine and desire, was one of the defining features of medieval affection. To love was not only to reach for another heart, but also to navigate the gaze of heaven. And in this navigation, in the balancing act between soul and body, between duty and passion, the medieval world created a vision of love that was at once burdened and exalted, fragile and eternal, heavy with meaning at every turn. If we leave the solemn halls of churches and step into the marketplaces and winding alleys of medieval towns, we discover another world of courtship, one that belonged not to nobles in castles or clerics in cathedrals, but to the people who lived their lives in the bustling rhythms of daily trade. Here love unfolded in quieter, humbler ways, yet no less meaningful. The medieval marketplace, with its mingling of merchants, farmers, craftsmen and travellers, was not only a centre of commerce but also one of the rare spaces where men and women could meet with a measure of freedom. Among the stalls of cloth, spices, bread and trinkets, glances could be exchanged, words traded, and futures shaped in ways as profound as any noble courtship. Imagine a busy town square on a spring morning. Merchants call out their wares, children dart between the stalls, and the air is filled with the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat. Among this noise, a young man approaches a woman's stall. She is selling dyed cloth, folded neatly in stacks. Their conversation begins with business, the price of a piece, the quality of the thread, but beneath the practical words lingers another conversation, silent and tentative. Perhaps he lingers longer than necessary, asking more questions than the purchase requires. Perhaps she lowers her gaze just slightly, her voice softening as she answers. In a world where reputations were watched closely, such moments had to remain cloaked in the everyday. Yet to those involved, they could carry the thrill of possibility. Guilds and crafts also shaped the paths of love in towns. Apprenticeship was a long road, binding young men to masters who taught them skills and discipline. Within these networks, connections were forged not only between craftsmen but between families. A blacksmith's apprentice might fall in love with the daughter of a weaver. Their courtship could be encouraged if it promised to strengthen the guild community, or discouraged if it crossed boundaries of rivalry or class. In these circles, love was practical, often tied to the shared labour of towns. Yet the shared rhythms of work, the passing of tools, the meeting of eyes across workshops, offered their own form of intimacy, a companionship born of proximity and shared effort. Markets and festivals overlapped in ways that made affection more visible. On holy days or special celebrations, towns burst into colour with banners, music and games. For many, these were the rare occasions when social boundaries loosened and people mingled more freely. Young men and women danced in circles, played games of chance, or joined in communal feasts. Though carefully watched by neighbours and family, such gatherings allowed for gestures that might otherwise be impossible. A hand briefly held, a song sung in someone's direction, a playful contest that turned into a declaration of interest. Festivals offered an air of freedom, a suspension of ordinary rules, where love could step forward more openly, if only for a short time. Yet, even in these lively spaces, the expectations of society weighed heavily. Courtship in towns was rarely private. Families, neighbours, and entire communities took interest in who courted whom, for every union affected the balance of labour, inheritance and reputation. A young couple who spent too much time together might face gossip. A woman whose affections seemed too freely given risked her standing. A man whose intentions were unclear risked disapproval. And so affection was carried out in half gestures and half-spoken words, in exchanges that could pass as business or neighbourly kindness, yet were charged with meaning for those who shared them. For wealthier townsfolk, marriage negotiations could be as complex as those of nobles. Merchants sought alliances that would expand trade networks, secure dowries, or strengthen ties with influential families. In such cases, young people often had little say, their futures shaped at tables where accounts and agreements were tallied. Yet even here, affection sometimes found a foothold. A young merchant might fall in love with the daughter of a rival, and though their families hesitated, the union could bring reconciliation. Or, in other cases, marriages arranged for wealth could blossom into genuine affection through the slow growth of companionship. The influence of the church also reached into towns, reminding couples of the sacredness of their vows and the dangers of sin. But urban settings, with their constant flow of people and ideas, often allowed more room for subtle defiance. Love letters exchanged in secret might pass through the hands of apprentices or servants. Meetings might be arranged under the cover of errands or trade. The very busyness of towns offered a kind of anonymity, a space where affection could hide in plain sight, folded between the motions of daily life. And then there were the storytellers, the travelling performers who carried tales of knights, lovers, and miracles into marketplaces. Gathered crowds listened to these stories, their imaginations stirred by visions of love grander than their own circumstances allowed. A young woman might hear of a lady courted by a brave knight and glance, almost shyly, at the craftsman standing nearby. A young man might hear of a shepherd's devotion and feel a sudden courage to speak more openly to the girl at the baker's stall. Stories gave shape to feelings, offering models of love that, though distant, gave meaning to their own quiet yearnings. At night, when the marketplace emptied and the lamps burned low, towns settled into a quieter rhythm. Within homes of timber and stone, couples who had once met in stalls and squares now shared lives together. Their affection was not the dazzling passion of troubadours or the lofty devotion of knights, but something humbler and no less deep, the daily partnership of preparing meals, raising children, and facing the uncertainties of the age. Love in this world revealed itself less in grand declarations than in shared labour, in the comfort of knowing that one's burdens were not borne alone. Thus, in the medieval towns and marketplaces, dating, or rather the beginnings of affection, was woven into the fabric of daily life. It was present in bargains struck over cloth, in dances during festivals, in the shared jokes of apprentices, and in the whispered stories that lingered long after the performers had moved on. It was never free of watchful eyes or heavy expectations, but it endured, humble and resilient, like the cobblestones beneath countless footsteps. And in those simple exchanges, medieval townsfolk found their own forms of romance, quieter, but as enduring as the towers of stone that rose above their crowded streets. If we drift now from the lively noise of town squares and markets into the quieter chambers of castles and manors, we encounter a world where courtship was both delicate and dangerous, wrapped in layers of etiquette that dictated every word, every glance, every gesture. In these noble households, affection was rarely a matter of impulse. Instead, it was choreographed with precision, guided by unwritten rules as rigid as the stone walls that enclosed them. To fall in love here was to enter a game of subtleties, where the stakes were not only the heart, but also the honour, reputation and stability of entire families. Life in the manor was defined by watchfulness. Servants, guards, companions and kin created an environment where privacy was scarce. A young lady of rank rarely found herself alone, her every move accompanied by attendants. For a suitor, this meant that even the smallest moment of connection, a hand brushed while passing a goblet, a folded note slipped into a book, a glance held too long, carried the thrill of daring. Nothing could be done openly. And yet, because of these boundaries, the smallest gestures swelled with meaning. To speak of the weather might be to speak of longing. To compliment a lady's embroidery might be to confess admiration. The art of noble courtship was the art of layering words with hidden weight. Consider the gatherings that filled castle halls, feasts, hunts, and entertainments where nobles displayed not only wealth but also their refinement. It was during these events that the rituals of courting played out. A knight might volunteer to serve a lady at table, cutting her meat or pouring her wine, each action both service and signal. A lady, in turn, might show favour by offering a ribbon, a token she could plausibly give without scandal, but which carried the unmistakable weight of attention. To outside eyes, these exchanges appeared proper, even mundane, yet within them burned the embers of desire carefully shielded from view. Letters, too, became vital instruments of affection. In noble households, where literacy was more common, words could carry what voices could not. A folded piece of parchment, sealed with wax, might slip through the hands of a trusted servant. The language of these letters was never blunt. Instead, it was veiled in metaphor, heavy with allegory, each phrase constructed to conceal as much as it revealed. A knight might write of loyalty to a distant star, or a lady might describe her admiration for a falcon that soars beyond her reach. Both knew what was meant, but the disguise allowed the words to survive scrutiny if ever discovered. The act of writing itself was dangerous, for if intercepted, it could ruin reputations and futures. And yet, for many, it was irresistible, the only way to give voice to feelings that could not be spoken aloud. Music and poetry also played central roles in these noble rituals. Troubadours and minstrels, welcomed into great halls, often became intermediaries, carrying songs that gave form to the emotions nobles could not declare outright. A lady might request a certain song, knowing its words would echo her own unspoken thoughts. A knight might commission a verse, cloaked in allegory but pointed toward a single listener in the room. These performances, though public, created private conversations hidden in plain sight. In the flicker of torchlight, amid the hum of laughter and conversation, the lovers heard what others could not. But just as affection in noble circles carried elegance, it also carried danger. A noblewoman was often already promised, her marriage arranged for political or economic advantage. A knight who courted her risked not only his honour but his life. If discovered, both could face ruin. She condemned as unfaithful, he branded as dishonourable. The very walls that gave their lives grandeur also imprisoned their desires, forcing love into secrecy and metaphor. This danger, paradoxically, intensified the emotions. To long for someone forbidden was to feel with a heightened clarity, as though each moment might be the last. Many of the great romances of the age, tales of Tristan and Isolde, of Lancelot and Guinevere, sprang from this tension, where passion collided with duty, and the result was both beautiful and tragic. For young nobles not yet bound by marriage contracts, the path of courtship was still no simple affair. Family approval was paramount, and matches were often judged more by land, dowry, and alliances than by affection. A noble son might fall in love with a woman of lower rank, but such unions were discouraged, sometimes forbidden outright. A noble daughter might wish to choose for herself, but her family's ambitions weighed heavier than her own heart. In this way, noble love was both privileged and restricted. It enjoyed the refinement of poetry, letters, and song, yet it was bound tighter than the affections of peasants who, though poorer, sometimes had greater freedom to choose. Still, within the walls of castles and manors, love carved out its quiet spaces. Gardens, chapels, libraries, these became sanctuaries for stolen moments. A whispered word in a cloister, a shared book of psalms, a meeting arranged under the pretext of prayer, these small acts carried enormous weight. Love here was not loud, not open, but delicate and deliberate, unfolding like the slow unfurling of a rose in a place where winter always threatened. It is important to remember, too, that noble affection often lived alongside performance. To be admired, to be courted, was part of a lady's social role, just as to devote oneself to a lady was part of a knight's. Sometimes these exchanges were sincere, sometimes they were strategic, meant to secure favour or prestige. The line between real feeling and ritual performance blurred, leaving us centuries later to wonder how much was genuine and how much was play. Yet perhaps in the medieval mind the distinction mattered less. To enact devotion was, in a sense, to feel it, To play the part of lover and beloved was to step into a role so powerful it could shape both heart and reputation. Thus, in the noble households of the Middle Ages, love was not the free-spirited wanderer it might seem to us today. It was a careful dance, a weaving of words, gestures, and silences, all performed under the constant gaze of others. It was fragile, veiled, and bound, yet for that very reason it glowed with an intensity that still captures our imagination. To love in a castle was to walk a tightrope strung between duty and desire, between public performance and private truth. And in that balancing act, medieval courtship revealed itself as one of the most intricate dances of all. If we leave the high halls of castles for a time and walk instead into the open countryside, we encounter another rhythm of love altogether, simpler, earthier, and shaped by the slow turning of seasons. Here in the villages and hamlets where most medieval people lived, affection was bound not by the glitter of tournaments or the polish of etiquette, but by the cycles of planting and harvest, the gossip of neighbours, and the pressing demands of survival. And yet, even in this quieter world, courtship carried its own rituals, some tender, some practical, all of them woven into the daily fabric of rural life. Imagine a small village nestled in a valley, its cottages thatched with straw, its lanes muddy from spring rain. The people here rise with the sun and rest with the dusk, their days filled with tilling fields, tending animals and mending tools. For young men and women, the opportunities to meet are limited, watched closely by families and neighbours. But within the narrow paths of village life, affection still found its way. A man might help a woman carry water from the well, his presence a silent declaration of interest. A woman might bake an extra loaf of bread and quietly set it aside for the man she admired. These gestures were not grand or poetic, but they were sincere, born from the same soil that sustained their lives. Festivals and holy days carried special importance in the countryside. These were moments when the entire community gathered in celebration, loosening the bonds of daily labour. Dancing in circles on the village green, singing songs around bonfires, or playing games in open fields. Such moments allowed young men and women to mingle more freely, to laugh together, to test the waters of affection without the heavy eyes of duty pressing quite so firmly. In the warmth of a May Day festival or the glow of a midsummer fire, love could be hinted at with a garland of flowers placed gently on someone's head, or with a partner chosen for a dance. For many, these fleeting exchanges marked the beginnings of courtships that would later settle into marriages, as much a matter of survival as of affection. Courtship in villages often involved practical considerations that were impossible to ignore. A young man's ability to provide a strong back for the fields, a skill with animals, a steady trade, mattered as much as his charm. A young woman's skills in spinning, weaving, or keeping a household were valued no less. Parents and neighbours took careful note of these qualities, for in a world where winters could be harsh and famine was never far, marriage was a partnership of necessity. Love, then, was measured not only in smiles and whispers, but in the quiet assurance that a household could endure together. Still, this does not mean affection was absent. In fact, the very constraints of village life made small gestures more powerful. A glance held across a churchyard, a gift of wildflowers left at a cottage door, a shared laugh while working in the fields. Such moments were treasured, remembered, and retold. Young people might steal brief meetings at the edge of a forest or by the banks of a stream, away from the eyes of their families. There, under the watch of the stars, words of affection could be spoken more freely, even if only in whispers. Marriage negotiations, when they came, were often modest affairs. Families might gather in a cottage to agree upon dowries, tools, or small plots of land. The young couple's voices were heard, but the decisions were guided by the elders, who weighed practical matters heavily. Once agreed, the union was marked by simple ceremonies, often followed by a meal shared with the village. Yet beneath the practical arrangements, affection sometimes thrived. A man and woman who had grown up together, worked side by side in fields, and shared countless festivals might find that love had grown naturally between them, a steady flame kindled over years of companionship. But not all stories were so gentle. In some villages, pressures to marry quickly, to secure labour for farms or heirs for families, left little room for choice. Young women could be promised without their full consent, and men too could find themselves bound by arrangements that served the community more than their own hearts. In such cases, affection sometimes had to bloom after marriage, growing slowly through shared work and mutual endurance. Others sought love elsewhere, in secret glances and forbidden meetings, risking scandal in communities where gossip travelled as fast as wind through fields of wheat. Tradition also carried peculiar customs that shaped rural courtship. In certain places, there were rituals in which young men would sing beneath the windows of women they admired, testing both their voices and their courage. Elsewhere, playful contests, races, dances, or even wrestling matches were staged as part of festivals, with young women choosing their partners based on skill and spirit. These rituals blurred the line between entertainment and courtship, offering structured ways for affection to declare itself without breaking the order of the community. The church, even here in the countryside, watched closely. Priests reminded villagers that love must remain chaste until blessed by marriage, and they often served as both counselors and overseers in courtship. Betrothals were blessed in chapels, vows made under the eyes of God and the community alike. Yet despite these admonitions, the human heart often wandered its own path, finding ways to express itself even within the narrow confines of expectation. And so, in the villages and hamlets of medieval Europe, love was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in that it was woven into daily work, into bread baked, fields ploughed, and water carried. Extraordinary in that even the smallest gestures carried weight, transforming necessity into tenderness, practicality into poetry. Love here did not blaze with the fire of troubadour songs or shine with the polish of chivalry, but it glowed quietly, like embers in a hearth that burned steadily through the long winters, keeping the home and the heart warm. If we listen carefully to the medieval night, past the sounds of markets closing and villages resting, we may hear the faint scratching of quills on parchment. For though most people could not write, those who could often turned to letters as their most secret and powerful form of courtship. In an age where love could rarely be spoken aloud, a letter became both a confession and a lifeline, a fragile bridge stretched between two hearts who lived under constant watch. To hold such a letter was to hold not only words but risk, and to send one was to entrust one's soul to paper. The art of the love letter in medieval times was not impulsive. Ink and parchment were precious, literacy itself a rarity. Those who wrote did so with great care, each word weighed and polished until it gleamed with meaning. A knight writing to his lady might never once use her name, hiding her identity behind symbols or metaphors. He might describe her as the sun that warms him, or the rose whose beauty gives him courage. A lady responding in turn might cloak her feelings in allegory, speaking of falcons that cannot be caught, or rivers that flow toward distant seas. This veiled language protected them, yet it also heightened the mystery, allowing them to speak boldly through the mask of poetry. Imagine a folded parchment sealed with wax slipped into the hands of a trusted servant. The servant knows the danger of discovery, yet loyalty and perhaps curiosity drive him to deliver it. He carries it beneath his cloak, through stone corridors or down muddy village lanes, and at last places it into waiting hands. The recipient, heart-trembling, breaks the seal by candlelight, careful to hide the faint crackle of parchment from listening ears. The words inside may be only a few sentences, yet they contain a world of longing, more precious than any jewel. In noble households, these letters were often elaborate, influenced by the traditions of courtly love. Latin phrases mingled with vernacular tongues, and quotations from classical poets were common, showing both education and devotion. The language was stylized, filled with flourishes and careful constructions, but beneath the ornament lay genuine emotion. To write was to risk, and the very act of putting ink to parchment turned private feeling into something tangible, something that could be kept, reread, and cherished. Among the clergy, too, letters sometimes played a role in forbidden affections. Monks and nuns, sworn to celibacy, occasionally found themselves caught in the pull of earthly love. Their letters, when discovered, shocked their contemporaries, for they revealed how even within cloisters the human heart could not be stilled. These writings often combine spiritual imagery with longing, describing the beloved as both saintly and desired, holy and human. They remind us that even those who had vowed to live apart from the world still carried within them the restless ache of affection. For common folk, love letters were rarer, for literacy was scarce. Yet even here, messages could be sent in humbler ways. A carving on a piece of wood, a symbol scratched into a wall, a rhyme memorized and carried by word of mouth, these too were forms of letters, born not of ink but of gesture. A lover might carve initials into a tree, knowing that the woman who walked that path would see them. A shepherd might tie knots in a ribbon, each knot carrying a meaning understood by the woman he admired. These were their letters, their way of giving form to feeling in a world where paper and ink were beyond reach. Secrecy was always the companion of such exchanges. Letters once written had to be hidden, for discovery could bring ruin. A husband might stumble upon a parchment not meant for his eyes, a priest might hear whispers of correspondence, a family might intercept a message before it reached its destination. The consequences could be severe: dishonor, broken alliances, even punishment. And yet, for many, the risk was worth the chance to express what silence forbade. The very danger of discovery made each word more powerful, each message more treasured. But letters were not always used for secrecy. In some betrothals, written agreements between families doubled as tokens of affection. Though practical in nature, these documents often included small flourishes of sentiment, a promise of loyalty, a blessing of future harmony, a line of kindness tucked between discussions of dowry and land. Even in formal contracts, the human heart found ways to inscribe itself. Some letters survive even now, their ink faded but their emotions still clear. A knight's trembling declaration to a lady who could never be his. A husband's words to his wife as he left for war, promising to return. A young woman's careful reply, her voice preserved across centuries in strokes of quill. Reading them today, we can feel the weight of their hearts, suspended in time, speaking to us as if from candlelit rooms long vanished. And yet, perhaps the most striking feature of medieval love letters was not their passion, but their patience. In a world without rapid communication, a letter might take weeks to travel, its reply delayed by distance, danger, or secrecy. Lovers learned to wait, to treasure silence as much as words. To receive a letter was to feel time collapse, to hold in one's hands the proof that someone, somewhere, was thinking of you. It was a quiet miracle, one that transformed absence into presence, distance into intimacy. Thus, in the medieval world, the love letter was more than parchment and ink. It was courage, hope, longing and trust folded into a fragile package. It was an act of defiance against silence, a declaration made in shadows, a whisper that could outlast even the loudest prohibitions. And in the flickering candlelight, when two hearts read each other's hidden words, the world seemed, for a moment, to open a door where love could breathe freely, even if only in secret. If we wander now into the rituals of weddings themselves, we see how medieval love, so often restrained in courtship, hidden in letters, whispered in gardens, at last found its most public expression. A wedding in the Middle Ages was not simply a union of two hearts. It was a contract, a display, a sacred vow, and a community event all at once. It was shaped as much by custom and necessity as by affection, and yet within its ceremonies and feasts, there was always space for tenderness, for moments when duty and love overlapped, if only briefly. At the heart of a medieval wedding was the union of families. For nobles, marriages were often political, binding houses together, securing land, wealth, or peace between rival lords. Negotiations could last months, sometimes years, and the wedding itself became the culmination of careful calculation. For peasants, the arrangements were simpler, but still practical. A dowry of livestock, tools, or a small patch of land, exchanged to ensure the new household could sustain itself. Yet no matter the rank, a wedding was a turning point, not only for the couple, but for the entire community around them. The ceremonies themselves varied across time and place, but many shared certain elements. Picture a small stone church, its walls cold but decorated with garlands of greenery. A priest stands at the altar, the couple before him. He asks their consent, not always a formality, for the church insisted that a valid marriage required both parties to agree. Hands are joined, vows spoken, blessings given. A ring might be exchanged, though not always. In some regions, a token as simple as a piece of cloth or a clasped hand sealed the promise. The community watched closely, for marriage was never private. It was a contract witnessed by all, binding not only two individuals but two families, two lineages, even two villages. For wealthier households, weddings could stretch into days of feasting. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, breads, fruits, and flagons of ale or wine. Music filled the halls, harps, lutes, and drums accompanying songs of celebration. Guests laughed, danced, and toasted the couple, the noise echoing into the night. Here, affection might peek through the rituals. A groom's shy glance at his bride as he lifted her cup, a bride's soft smile as they joined in the first dance. Even if their match had been arranged, the wedding allowed for a public acknowledgement of their new bond, a moment when hope and joy took precedence over obligation. For peasants, the celebrations were humbler, but no less heartfelt. After vows spoken in a small chapel or before the village priest, neighbours gathered in barns or open fields, bringing food to share. Bread, cheese, and ale formed the heart of the feast, and music was often supplied by local fiddlers or singers. Dancing followed, simple circle dances that brought the entire community together. Laughter and song filled the night, and for a brief time, daily struggles were forgotten. The new couple was not only blessed by the priest, but embraced by their neighbours, their union affirmed through the joy of shared festivity. Traditions also carried symbolic gestures. In some places, the bride and groom drank from the same cup of wine, symbolising unity. In others, they stepped across a threshold together, marking their entrance into a shared household. Some communities practiced the hand-fasting ritual, where hands were literally bound together with a cord or ribbon, a practice that still lingers in echoes today. Each gesture carried meaning, turning the wedding into a tapestry of symbols that spoke of union, loyalty, and hope for the future. Yet, weddings were not only about joy, they also carried weighty expectations. A bride often left her family behind, stepping into a new household where she might be surrounded by strangers. A groom took on the burden of ensuring the survival of his new family. The vows they spoke were not just words of love, but promises of labour, endurance, and responsibility. To marry was to step into adulthood fully, with all its struggles and demands. Still, even within these heavy obligations, affection could grow. For some, love had begun long before the wedding, nurtured in dances, letters, or secret glances. For others, it began afterward, forged through the daily rhythms of shared work and shared burdens. A husband and wife might come to know each other, not in the heat of passion, but in the quiet of winter nights, in the tending of children, in the long companionship of years. Their love was less about declarations than about constancy, a steady flame that endured through both joy and hardship. The memory of weddings lingered long after the day itself. Songs were composed, stories told, and anniversaries remembered in quiet ways. For noble families, chroniclers might record the union in their manuscripts, framing it as an important moment in lineage. For villagers, the memory lived in gossip, in the retelling of the feast's laughter, in the knowledge that two households had become one. Thus, in the medieval world, weddings stood at the crossroads of love and duty, of faith and survival. They were moments when the entire community paused to witness, to celebrate, and to affirm the bonds that held society together. And though they were heavy with ritual and necessity, they also contained within them the possibility of tenderness, of beginnings not only of households, but of affections that might last a lifetime. In the joining of hands beneath the shadow of church walls or the open sky of village greens, love found one of its rare public stages, shining, if only briefly, before settling once more into the quiet rhythms of daily life. If we step away from the ceremonies of marriage and into the quiet shadows that linger behind them, we find another dimension of medieval love, one not spoken in vows or blessed by priests, but whispered in secrecy and hidden beneath layers of caution. These were the forbidden romances, the affairs that crossed the lines of family honour, of marriage contracts, of the church's stern warnings. They lived in silence, in glances across crowded rooms, in meetings arranged at dusk, in the delicate balance between passion and peril. In a society where duty pressed heavily on every heart, These secret loves carried both intensity and danger, glowing like candles hidden in dark corners. For nobles, forbidden love often unfolded within the very courts that celebrated ideals of chivalry. A knight might swear loyalty to a lady who was not his wife, but the wife of his lord, pledging himself to her service in ways that blurred the line between devotion and desire. To love another man's wife was a perilous act, one that could mean exile, disgrace, or even death if discovered. Yet the very impossibility of such love gave it strength. The more dangerous the bond, the more precious each stolen word became. We see echoes of this in the legends that filled medieval imagination. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, tales of passion so consuming that it defied law, church and duty. These stories were both warnings and temptations, showing the devastation of forbidden desire and yet preserving its allure. In villages too, secret loves existed, though their risks were smaller in scale but no less profound. A young woman betrothed by her family might find her heart drawn toward another. A man bound in a loveless marriage might seek tenderness in the arms of someone forbidden. In small communities where gossip travelled quickly, such affairs were dangerous. Discovery could lead to shame, punishment, or exclusion. Yet even here, the heart sometimes rebelled against the strict lines drawn around it. Meetings might be arranged in barns after dark, or in the shelter of forests, away from the watching eyes of neighbours. The simplicity of rural life did not shield people from the complexities of longing. It only made them harder to conceal. Letters, poems, and songs often became the vessels of these hidden affections. A knight might pen verses that could be read as devotion to God or country, but which carried secret meanings for one woman alone. A lady might compose embroidery that seemed a simple decoration, but contained symbols known only to her beloved. In villages, gifts of food, carved trinkets or ribbons could pass quietly between hands, each carrying unspoken words. These tokens, innocent to outsiders, burned with meaning for those who exchanged them. The church's presence loomed heavily over these hidden bonds. Priests preached against adultery, reminding the faithful of eternal punishment for those who strayed. Confessionals became stages for guilt, as lovers whispered their secrets to God through the ears of a priest. Yet even confession could not extinguish passion. Many carried on their hidden romances despite their remorse, torn between the pull of faith and the pull of their hearts. It is in these struggles that we see the humanity of the Middle Ages most clearly. Not saints or sinners alone, but ordinary people wrestling with love that did not fit the rules. Forbidden romances were not always tragic. Some endured quietly, never discovered, forming secret threads within the tapestry of daily life. Others grew into lasting bonds that eventually overcame obstacles, whether through widowhood, shifts in fortune, or the slow softening of family resistance. Yet many ended in sorrow, as circumstances and society pressed too heavily against them. And still, people continued to risk everything, for the heart does not always bend to custom or command. There is a peculiar beauty in these hidden loves, because they were lived in fragments. Brief meetings, stolen words, fleeting glances, they were never allowed to fade into the ordinariness of daily life. Each moment was heightened, intensified by the knowledge that it could be the last. To stand near each other at a feast and speak only of weather, while knowing the depth of feeling beneath the words, gave those words a weight invisible to all but two. To brush hands while passing a cup, to walk side by side in a procession with eyes fixed ahead but hearts burning inwardly. These fragments became lifetimes, compressed into moments. The stories of forbidden love that survive, whether written in poems, whispered in chronicles, or passed down in song, remind us that love in the medieval world was not only about duty or contract. It was also about defiance, about reaching for something beyond what was permitted. In these stories, passion becomes not just emotion but rebellion, a quiet insistence that the human heart could not be entirely controlled by family, by church, or by law. And so while marriages bound families and communities, and the church sanctified unions with holy words, beneath the surface ran another current, the hidden stream of secret affections. It was dangerous, it was fragile, but it was also deeply human. These loves remind us that even in an age of rigid structures, people still yearned, still risked, still sought moments of tenderness where they could. They lived in secrecy, in silence, in shadows, but they lived, enduring as long as there were hearts willing to defy the rules for the sake of feeling. If we pause for a moment and look not at the noble courts or the hidden romances, but at the great cultural movement that swept across medieval Europe, we find ourselves in the age of troubadours, minstrels and poets whose verses gave shape to how people imagined love. It was not just lived. It was sung, performed, recited, and passed from mouth to ear until it became a shared dream that stretched across kingdoms. To speak of love in this world was to step into a tradition older than oneself, to borrow words that had been crafted to carry longing, devotion, and despair with the rhythm of music and the beauty of metaphor. The troubadours of southern France are often remembered as the first great voices of this tradition. Emerging in the 12th century, they travelled from court to court, carrying songs of fin amour, or refined love. Their poetry painted love as a noble pursuit, an aspiration that lifted men and women above the ordinary. In their verses, love was not crude or base, but elevated, an ennobling force that could make a knight braver, a lady wiser, a human being closer to perfection. These songs, often dedicated to unattainable women, celebrated yearning itself as a virtue. To desire, even without fulfillment, was considered beautiful, even purifying. Imagine a candlelit hall where a troubadour begins to play his lute. The audience gathers, nobles in silk, attendants at their side, servants lingering at the edges to catch fragments of song. His voice rises, carrying verses that speak of a knight who would rather suffer in longing than betray his devotion, or of a lady whose smile is brighter than dawn. Listeners nod, sigh, and sometimes glance at one another, recognizing themselves in the words. For in these songs, personal feelings found a mirror, elevated into something timeless. But it was not only troubadours who shaped the language of love. Minstrels, jongleurs, and later trouvères in northern France carried their own variations, adapting the lofty ideals into forms that reached broader audiences. While troubadours often performed for refined courts, minstrels brought music into markets, fairs, and festivals, where peasants and townsfolk could listen, laugh, and dream. Their songs were sometimes bawdier, more humorous, or more practical, but still they carried the essence of affection, teaching listeners that love was not merely a private matter, but a shared experience, a theme that bound communities together. Poets, too, joined in this cultural flowering. Figures like Chrétien de Troyes wove romances into long narratives, blending chivalry, devotion, and adventure. His tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, for instance, offered not only entertainment, but a model of how love could be imagined, dangerous, consuming, yet noble in its intensity. These literary works spread across Europe, copied by scribes, read aloud in courts, and influencing generations of listeners. Love was no longer only a private emotion, but a subject of art, philosophy, and performance. And yet these songs and stories were not without tension. The Church, wary of the focus on earthly passion, warned against the danger of desire that placed mortals above God. Some clerics criticized troubadours for glorifying adultery, or for painting longing as a virtue rather than a temptation. Yet even their warnings could not silence the songs. They continued to spread, carried by memory and music, weaving themselves into the imagination of an age that hungered for beauty amid hardship. For those who lived in this world, the impact of these cultural traditions was profound. A knight might measure his devotion by the standards of poetry, shaping his gestures to mirror the ideals sung in verse. A lady might respond to suitors with the grace and aloofness expected of the heroines in songs, cultivating an image of dignity that heightened her appeal. Even peasants, though far removed from the refined courts, absorbed fragments of this culture, humming melodies at their work or repeating verses they had heard at a fair. Love, as sung by troubadours and poets, became a kind of shared vocabulary, a way for people of all ranks to understand and articulate feelings that otherwise might remain silent. It is striking to consider how much of our modern notion of romance traces its roots to this age. The idea that love should be noble, that longing itself has dignity, that devotion can inspire greatness. These concepts were not born in our time, but in the songs sung centuries ago beneath vaulted ceilings and open skies. The medieval world, with its hardship, wars, and rigid hierarchies, still found space to dream of love as something more than necessity. Through its poetry, it dared to imagine love as a force that could transform, elevate, and endure. And so, in the 13th century and beyond, the cultural legacy of troubadours, minstrels, and poets continued to shape how people loved and how they dreamed of love. Their words lingered not only in manuscripts, but in the hearts of those who listened, carrying across time the vision of romance as both exalted and impossible, both fragile and eternal. In their songs, the medieval world gave love its voice, and that voice, soft and lyrical, still whispers to us even now. If we leave the halls where troubadours sang and turn our gaze toward the daily lives of women in the medieval world, we discover another layer of love and courtship, one shaped by the expectations, restrictions, and occasional freedoms that defined their roles. To understand dating, or rather the pursuit of affection, in those centuries, we must understand the place of women, for it was around them that much of medieval love was imagined, performed, and controlled. And yet, though confined by custom, women were not passive figures. They held influence, subtle and profound, in the unfolding of romance. In noble households, a woman's life was often mapped before she had the chance to shape it herself. Daughters of lords and ladies were valuable pieces in the game of alliances, their marriages arranged to strengthen political ties, secure land, or cement peace. From a young age, they were taught to move with grace, to speak with caution, and to cultivate an air of dignity that could enhance their value in these negotiations. But within these constraints, women found ways to exercise choice, however limited. A smile withheld, a gift returned, a favour granted, all could shape the course of a suitor's pursuit. They could not always refuse, but they could influence, and in those small spaces of influence, they carved their own agency. For some noble women, affection was woven into the rituals of courtly love. Surrounded by knights who swore loyalty to them, they became the objects of admiration, praised in songs and poems, courted through symbolic gestures. To accept a token, to allow a knight to wear her colours, was to step into a role both powerful and perilous. She gained prestige from his devotion, but also risked gossip or scandal if the admiration grew too bold. And yet many women used these rituals to strengthen their positions, knowing that influence over a knight's heart could translate into influence within the court itself. In villages and towns, the roles of women were different, but no less central. Their contributions to households, spinning, weaving, cooking, tending animals, raising children, were essential to survival. Here, courtship was shaped less by poetry than by practicality. A woman's skills, her reputation, and her family standing determined much about her prospects. Yet, she too had choices to make. A woman could show favour through food shared, through a place saved beside her at a feast, or through accepting a man's help with daily labour. These gestures, simple but meaningful, were ways of signalling interest without words. And because village life was so closely bound, such signals were quickly noticed by others, weaving personal affection into the larger fabric of community life. For women in the church, love took yet another form. Nuns, cloistered behind convent walls, were expected to devote themselves entirely to God. Yet their writings reveal hearts not untouched by longing. Mystical texts often describe the soul's union with the divine, in language drawn from human love, full of imagery of yearning, embrace, and devotion. Though directed toward God, these words echo the same desires we find in secular love poems, showing how deeply human emotion shaped even spiritual experience. Some nuns and holy women did form bonds that stretched beyond the purely spiritual, their letters and confessions revealing attachments that blurred the line between divine and earthly affection. Across all ranks, women bore the weight of reputation more heavily than men. A rumour of impropriety could damage not only their own standing, but that of their entire family. And so they learned to navigate love with care, balancing desire with caution, affection with discretion. Yet within these limits, they could be bold in ways history sometimes forgets. Chronicles and letters tell of women who pursued the men they desired, who found ways to arrange meetings, who spoke words of passion even when silence was expected. Their actions remind us that medieval women were not merely passive recipients of love, but active participants, shaping their own stories as best they could. Consider the image of a young noblewoman, her hair covered by a veil, her eyes lowered as she sits in a hall filled with chatter. To most, she appears silent, dutiful, a figure of decorum. But beneath the surface, her mind is alive with calculation. Which knight has shown her true devotion? Which suitor might bring her both security and affection? Whose poetry touches her heart, whose gifts reveal sincerity? She cannot speak these thoughts aloud, but she carries them nonetheless, navigating the delicate balance between duty and longing with intelligence and care. Or think of a village woman standing at a well, speaking briefly with a young man who helps her lift her bucket. Their conversation is brief, their words ordinary. Yet in that moment, a decision is made to trust him, to favour him, to allow affection to grow. Her choice, though quiet, will shape not only her life but the household she will build, the children she will raise, the future of her small corner of the world. The medieval imagination often placed women on pedestals, praising them as ideals of beauty, grace, or virtue. Yet in reality, women lived lives of complexity, full of quiet decisions and subtle power. They were bound by structures of family, church, and community, but within those structures they found ways to love, to choose, to influence, and to endure. And it was through them, through their presence, their responses, their silences, and their words, that much of medieval courtship took its shape. Thus, when we speak of medieval love, we are always in some way speaking of women, as objects of devotion in songs, as partners in marriages of duty, as figures of yearning in secret romances, as voices of longing in spiritual texts, as steady companions in households of labour. They were at once constrained and central, silent and yet powerful, hidden and yet luminous in the stories that survive. Through their lives, we glimpse how love was not only imagined but lived, in all its fragility, risk and quiet strength. If we turn now to the world of men in the Middle Ages, we find that their experience of love and courtship was equally layered with duty, risk, and longing. For men, to pursue affection was often to balance courage with restraint, desire with honour, and ambition with humility. Their role was outward, visible, shaped by expectations to prove strength, loyalty, and worth. Yet beneath the armour of chivalry or the toil of labour, the medieval man's heart was as vulnerable, as uncertain, as quietly hopeful as any. For knights and noblemen, love was framed by the ideals of service. A man proved himself not by bold declarations, but by actions that demonstrated loyalty. To fight in a tournament wearing a lady's token, to compose poetry in her honour, to risk danger in her name, these were the acceptable forms of affection, wrapped in the guise of duty. A knight's longing was rarely his alone. It was displayed as performance, watched by courts, sanctioned by the language of chivalry. Yet even in these stylized rituals, true feeling could grow. A glance exchanged before battle, a token tied around an arm, might mean more to a knight than any victory. His devotion, though acted out for the world to see, was still deeply personal, carrying the quiet ache of hope. For merchants, craftsmen and peasants, the path of love was different but no less significant. Here, courtship was measured in labour and provision. A man's worth as a suitor rested not on poetry or jousts, but on his ability to provide stability, a steady income, a skill in trade, a strong arm for the fields. A carpenter might woo a woman with a finely made chest, a farmer by showing he had enough land to feed a family. In villages, the love of a man was revealed through his willingness to share work, to lighten burdens, to prove himself trustworthy. A loaf of bread given, a hand offered to repair a roof, a song sung at a festival, these gestures spoke more than words. But even here, love was not only duty. Men, too, felt the thrill of nervous glances, the uncertainty of waiting for a sign, the joy of being favoured. In poems and letters that survive, we glimpse men baring their hearts, writing of sleepless nights, of hunger not for food, but for a woman's smile. Their words remind us that medieval masculinity was not only strength and labour, but also vulnerability, the willingness to yearn openly, to risk humiliation for the chance of affection. Among clerics and scholars, the experience of love was shaped by vows and ideals of celibacy. Yet even here, hearts were restless. Letters survive from monks and priests who confessed affections they could not act upon, their words tangled between devotion to God and desire for human closeness. For scholars too, love appeared in their writings, often expressed through allegories and philosophical reflections. They spoke of love as an intellectual pursuit, a force that could lead the soul closer to truth. And yet, behind these lofty words, one senses the same human pull, the same quiet need for connection. The risks of love were felt heavily by men. To pursue a noblewoman above one's station could invite ruin. To overstep in a village could provoke anger from families or neighbours. Reputation was fragile, and a man who courted recklessly risked dishonour. Yet bravery in love was valued as much as bravery in war. To risk rejection was a mark of sincerity, and to endure longing with patience was seen as virtue. Thus, men were expected not only to act but to endure, to suffer love with dignity if it was not returned. Consider a squire, young and untested, serving in a noble household. He sees a lady each day at meals, her presence filling his thoughts. He cannot speak, for his station is low, but he writes clumsy verses by candlelight, hides them away, and dreams of one day daring to reveal them. His life is filled with tasks, polishing armour, serving wine, but his heart beats with a rhythm that belongs only to her. His story is not written in chronicles, yet it is no less real than those of kings and knights. Or picture a peasant at harvest, sweat running down his brow as he lifts bundles of wheat. Across the field, a woman works beside her family. He finds ways to help her, to ease her load, to walk her home when the sun sets. His affection is simple, unadorned, but powerful. He does not have troubadours to sing for him, but his devotion is written in the rhythm of his work, in the strength of his labour, in the constancy of his presence. His courtship is not poetry, but it is love nonetheless. And then there were the men who defied the rules entirely, who risked everything for passion. Some pursued affairs with married women, knowing discovery could destroy them. Others defied their families, choosing partners beneath their station. These men lived dangerously, driven by longing stronger than fear. Their stories, often ending in tragedy, filled the romances and cautionary tales of the age. Yet their willingness to risk all for love reveals how powerful the force of affection was, even in a world bound by law, church, and custom. Thus, the medieval man's experience of love was as diverse as his station. For knights, it was ritual and devotion. For peasants, labour and provision. For clerics, longing restrained by vows. For all, it was risk, vulnerability, and hope. They too dreamed, suffered, and reached for connection, their hearts beating as anxiously and as tenderly as any. Beneath the armour, beneath the calloused hands, beneath the robes of scholars and priests, lay the same truth. To be a man in the Middle Ages was not only to fight, to work, or to serve, but also to love, in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. If we wander now into the spaces between the grand stories and the quiet villages, we find ourselves in the realm of rituals, those curious traditions and customs that mark the path of love in the Middle Ages. These were not simply superstitions or entertainments. They were the shared practices that gave shape to affection, that allowed men and women to express longing, hope, or choice in ways their societies could recognize. Some were playful, some solemn, some deeply symbolic, but all carried meaning in a world where love was rarely spoken openly. One of the most intriguing rituals was hand fasting. In many parts of Europe, before marriage became fully absorbed into the sacramental authority of the church, couples pledged themselves to one another by literally binding their hands together with a cord or ribbon. This gesture, sometimes temporary, sometimes lasting a year and a day, symbolized their intent to marry or their bond as partners. It was both public and private, a visible act that neighbours could witness, but also deeply intimate, as two people stood side by side, hands clasped, eyes meeting. For some, it was a prelude to marriage. For others, it was marriage itself. Seasonal festivals also carried their own traditions of courtship. At May Day celebrations, for instance, young men and women wove garlands of flowers, symbols of fertility and renewal. A man might place a garland at a woman's door, a silent declaration of interest. If she accepted, she wore it openly, and the village understood her choice. In some regions, May couples formed during these festivals, walking together, dancing together, and sometimes pledging themselves at least for the season in a union half playful, half serious. Such rituals allowed young people to explore affection within the framework of community celebration, their choices visible but softened by festivity. Gifts, too, carried ritual significance. A ribbon, a carved token, a lock of hair, each was more than an object, it was a symbol of trust and devotion. A knight receiving a lady's favour tied it to his arm before a tournament, carrying her presents with him into combat. A peasant receiving a small token might keep it hidden in a pouch, drawing it out at night as a reminder of affection. These gestures, though small, were ritualized, repeated across centuries, giving people a shared language of love that transcended words. Courtship games often bridged the space between ritual and play. In some villages, young people sang beneath windows, serenading those they admired. The response, whether the shutters opened, a candle was lit, or silence remained, was a kind of answer, a ritualized dialogue without direct words. In other places, playful contests at festivals allowed women to choose partners from among the competitors, a way of testing not only skill but charm and character. These customs, though seemingly light-hearted, carried weight, for they could determine the beginnings of marriages and the weaving together of households. Superstitions also shaped how people approached love. Charms and tokens were believed to influence affection. Herbs tucked into clothing, knots tied in ribbons, whispered prayers said at certain times of day. A woman might carry rosemary for remembrance, or a man might carve a symbol into wood to draw fortune in love. The line between superstition and ritual blurred, but in both the desire was the same, to give uncertain feelings some structure, to make the unpredictable realm of love feel at least a little more ordered. The Church, wary of pagan echoes in these customs, sought to reshape them, blessing certain rituals while condemning others. Handfasting, once common, was gradually folded into church marriage, its power redirected under holy authority. Festivals, once filled with dancing and playful unions, were brought under closer supervision, their rituals softened into harmless entertainments. Yet even with these efforts, the old customs persisted, carried forward by people who found in them not sin but joy and meaning. Imagine a village green on a May morning. The air is fresh, with the scent of flowers, the ground soft with dew. Young men and women gather, laughter bubbling as garlands are woven, songs sung. A boy, nervous but determined, places a garland on the door of a girl he has long admired. She steps out, cheeks flushed, and lifts it to her head. The crowd cheers, and in that moment a bond is declared, not binding, not eternal, but real enough to shape their futures. Such rituals, fleeting and delicate, gave love its public face in communities where private declarations were rare. In noble courts, the rituals took on grander forms. Banquets and dances were themselves stages of courtship, where invitations, seating arrangements, and partners chosen for dances carried coded messages. A knight might be invited to sit near a lady as a sign of favour, or deliberately placed farther away to cool his hopes. A single dance, its steps measured and graceful, could mean as much as weeks of conversation. Here, too, ritual provided the framework through which affection could be hinted at, tested, and displayed. Rituals of love in the Middle Ages reveal how deeply people longed to give shape to the intangible. Love was invisible, fragile, easily hidden, but through garlands, dances, handfastings, tokens, and songs, it became something the community could see, something that could be honoured or questioned, celebrated or constrained. And in these rituals, both playful and solemn, we glimpse how medieval men and women sought not only to feel, but to belong, to anchor their affections in customs that gave meaning to their fleeting, vulnerable desires. If we turn our gaze now toward the darker corners of medieval affection, we find not only the poetry of troubadours and the joy of festivals, but also the heavy hand of law and authority, pressing down upon the human heart. For in the Middle Ages, love did not exist outside of order. It was monitored by families, weighed by contracts, sanctioned by the church, and, when necessary, punished by the courts. To fall in love could be sweet, but it could also be dangerous. And when affection strayed beyond what society permitted, it was not merely a personal matter, it became a legal one. Marriage laws were some of the most carefully guarded regulations of the age. The church declared marriage a sacrament, and civil authorities recognized it as a binding contract. Without consent, a union was invalid. Without witnesses, it could be contested. Yet for all its emphasis on consent, in practice, the voice of families often outweighed the voices of those to be married. Fathers and lords arranged unions to secure dowries, land, or alliances, and the couple themselves had little say. If a young man or woman resisted, they risked not only angering their family but violating the church's teaching, which demanded obedience. Love in this world was always entangled with duty, and to choose otherwise could bring grave consequences. Adultery was one of the most dangerous transgressions. For nobles, it threatened not only personal honor but political stability, for questions of inheritance and lineage could shake entire dynasties. A woman accused of infidelity risked ruin, her reputation shattered, her family shamed, her future uncertain. Men, too, could be punished, though often with less severity. Court records reveal cases where lovers were fined, imprisoned, or forced into humiliating public penance. In some places, punishments were harsher still: exile, corporal punishment, even death. And yet, despite the risks, forbidden love persisted, proving that the heart often rebelled against the law. Among common folk, the boundaries were equally strict, though enforced more by community than by written law. In villages, gossip was a form of judgment, and neighbours acted as the guardians of morality. A young couple who met too often without betrothal might be publicly shamed. A woman accused of straying could be scorned, her chances for marriage ruined. Men, too, were expected to follow codes of honour, and those who broke promises of marriage could face legal disputes or demands for compensation. In a society where every household's survival depended on cooperation, love was not only personal, it was everyone's concern. Betrothal itself carried legal weight. To promise marriage and then withdraw was not merely a broken heart, it was grounds for dispute. Court records speak of lawsuits brought against men who abandoned engagements, accused of dishonouring women and leaving them vulnerable. Sometimes these cases ended in forced marriages, other times in fines or restitution. The law in these matters was not designed to protect romance, but to protect stability, ensuring that households and communities remained intact. Even clandestine marriages, unions made in secret, without the blessing of family or priest, were watched closely. The church condemned them, for they bypassed its authority, yet it also recognized them as binding if consent had been freely given. This paradox created endless complications, as couples who wed in secret later sought recognition, or families contested such unions to preserve their interests. The tension between personal desire and communal order was never fully resolved, and the law was the battleground on which it played out. Punishments for breaches of conduct were often public, for public shame was a powerful tool. A man caught in adultery might be paraded through town, mocked by neighbours, his dignity stripped away. A woman might be forced to wear a sign of her transgression, her body displayed as a warning. The harshness of these punishments reflected the seriousness with which medieval society regarded love, not as a private indulgence, but as a matter that touched honour, inheritance, and the divine order itself. And yet, even in the shadow of punishment, affection thrived. Lovers found ways to meet in secret, to exchange letters, to continue despite the risks. The law could impose fear, but it could not silence longing. In fact, the very existence of such strict rules reveals how persistent love was, how deeply it unsettled the structures of medieval life. For if love had not been so powerful, there would have been no need to guard it so fiercely. Imagine a young couple in a small town, their families opposed to their union. They meet in secret by a riverbank, whispering vows to one another, knowing that discovery could bring shame or worse. Yet they continue, for to them, the risk is worth the chance to be together. Or picture a noblewoman who falls in love with a knight not chosen for her by her family. She writes him letters, hides them in prayer books, and dreams of a life she knows may never be allowed. Their stories, fragile and dangerous, were lived not only in defiance of custom, but also under the constant threat of law. Thus, the medieval world reminds us that love was never free. It was always weighed against duty, honour, faith, and law. To love within the rules was to walk carefully, fulfilling obligations, securing alliances, raising families. To love outside them was to step into peril, risking reputation, stability, even life. Yet for all the laws, for all the punishments, the human heart remained unruly, finding ways to reach for what it desired. And it is perhaps in this tension, between law and longing, order and rebellion, that medieval love shows its most human face. Not perfect, not free, but enduring, even when forbidden. If we step now into the great tapestry of medieval imagination, we find love not only lived in daily life, but also woven into myths, legends, and literature that outlasted the age itself. These were the stories people told by firelight, the verses copied by scribes, the epics sung by travelling poets. Through them, love became more than a personal experience. It became an ideal, a narrative, a mirror for the hopes and fears of an entire civilization. To understand medieval dating and courtship, we must also understand these tales, for they shaped how people dreamed of love, even when reality was far more restrained. Among the most famous are the romances of Arthurian legend. In the halls of kings and queens, listeners were enthralled by stories of knights like Lancelot, who gave his heart to Queen Guinevere, wife of his sovereign, King Arthur. Their love, passionate yet forbidden, was at once an inspiration and a warning. It elevated the idea that devotion could make a man braver, more noble, more selfless. Yet it also showed how love, when it defied duty, could unravel kingdoms. The tale of Tristan and Isolde carried similar themes. Two lovers bound by fate, consumed by passion, yet destroyed by the very intensity of their bond. These stories were told and retold not because they offered neat resolutions, but because they captured the contradictions of love itself, noble and dangerous, uplifting and ruinous. The popularity of such romances reflected a hunger to see love elevated beyond marriage contracts and social duty. They offered a vision of passion as something transformative, worth suffering for, even worth dying for. In their audiences, knights and ladies could imagine themselves as heroes of feeling, their own small gestures of affection magnified into something grand and timeless. For peasants, who heard these stories through minstrels or travelling performers, the tales offered a glimpse of a different world, one where love was not just survival or duty, but destiny. Love also found expression in allegory. One of the most influential works of the Middle Ages, The Romance of the Rose, painted love as a great symbolic garden, a place of pursuit, resistance, temptation, and triumph. Its verses guided readers through the stages of desire, from admiration to longing to fulfillment, all described through metaphors of flowers, walls, and guardians. Though controversial in its frankness, it shaped how generations thought of love as both a game and a quest, a challenge that tested virtue as much as passion. Religious literature, too, was steeped in the language of love, though directed toward the divine. Mystics described their union with God in terms borrowed from earthly affection, longing, embrace, even ecstasy. The writings of figures like Hildegard of Bingen or Bernard of Clairvaux reveal how deeply intertwined spiritual and romantic language could become. To love God was described in the same breathless intensity as lovers spoke of each other, blurring the line between sacred and secular. In this way, even the Church's literature fed into the broader culture of passion, shaping how people understood desire as both holy and human. Folk tales and songs carried simpler but no less powerful images of love. Ballads told of shepherds and maidens, of promises made beneath trees, of lovers separated by war or by parents' disapproval. These stories, often sung in villages, reflected the realities of ordinary people, grounding love not in castles or quests, but in fields, markets, and riversides. A shepherd's devotion, a maiden's constancy, these were celebrated with the same fervour as the exploits of knights, reminding listeners that love belonged not only to the powerful, but to all. It is striking how many of these stories ended not in happiness, but in sorrow. Lovers parted, betrayed, or punished. Perhaps this reflected the medieval understanding that passion was as perilous as it was beautiful. In a world bound by law, faith, and family, love that sought to rise above those limits was often destined for tragedy. Yet the very persistence of these tales shows that people longed to imagine love as something worth every risk, even if the cost was heartbreak. Consider a medieval listener, sitting in a crowded hall as a minstrel begins to sing. The flicker of firelight dances across faces, and the air is filled with the melody of lute and voice. As the story unfolds, of knights who risk all for devotion, of ladies who choose love over duty, the listener's heart stirs. Perhaps he sees in the tale a reflection of his own secret longing, a feeling too dangerous to speak aloud. Perhaps she imagines herself as the heroine, admired and desired, her choices carrying weight beyond her daily life. These stories were more than entertainment. They were vessels of imagination, allowing people to live through love in ways their own lives might never permit. The legacy of these myths and romances has endured far beyond the Middle Ages. They laid the foundation for later notions of romantic love, influencing poets, playwrights, and storytellers for centuries. When we think today of love as destiny, as sacrifice, as transformation, we are still hearing echoes of medieval halls where troubadours sang of Tristan, Isolde, Lancelot, and Guinevere. Their voices, though faint, continue to shape the way we dream. Thus, in the stories and legends of the Middle Ages, we glimpse not only how love was lived, but how it was imagined. Larger than life, filled with contradictions, at once noble and destructive. These tales gave people a way to make sense of their own yearnings, to see their private desires reflected in grand, tragic beauty. And in that reflection, medieval love was not only preserved, but immortalized, written into the very fabric of culture, where it still lingers like a song that never fully fades. If we step away from the songs of knights and the verses of poets, we begin to see how love and courtship were not only imagined, but lived across the wide variety of medieval cultures. For while Europe shared certain traditions, chivalry, courtly love, church rituals, each region gave its own flavour to the experience of affection. To wander through France, England, Italy, Spain, or the Germanic lands is to discover a patchwork of customs shaped by language, faith, climate, and history, each offering its own perspective on what it meant to love. In France, the cradle of troubadour culture, love was refined into art. The courts of Provence became famous for their courts of love, gatherings where noble women judged cases of passion as if they were trials, deciding whether a knight's devotion was genuine or whether a lady's refusal was just. Though partly theatrical, these gatherings reflected the seriousness with which the French nobility treated love, not simply as private emotion, but as a subject worthy of judgment, philosophy, and rules. Here, affection was imagined as a noble pursuit, something that elevated the heart and the soul. To be French in the 12th century was to live in a land where love itself was treated as a discipline, as structured and serious as music or rhetoric. England, however, leaned more heavily into the traditions of loyalty and marriage as duty. Though influenced by French troubadours and Arthurian romances, English culture often tied love closely to land, inheritance, and law. Courtship here was pragmatic, concerned with alliances and survival. Yet even within this practicality, English poets found room for tenderness. The ballads of the countryside told of shepherds and maidens, of green fields and stolen kisses. These simpler songs balanced the weight of duty with the sweetness of affection, creating a blend of realism and romance that reflected the island's character, practical yet not untouched by dream. In Italy, love was infused with passion and philosophy. The poets of the late Middle Ages, most famously Dante and Petrarch, transformed personal longing into works of eternal beauty. Dante's devotion to Beatrice, idealized and spiritualized, reimagined love as a path to divine truth. Petrarch's longing for Laura, captured in sonnets that would echo for centuries, framed love as inspiration, a source of suffering that ennobled the soul. Italian courtship was deeply tied to urban culture, to the rise of cities like Florence and Venice, where merchants and scholars mingled with poets and artists. Here, love was not only a matter of heart, but also of intellect, shaped by the Renaissance spirit that began to bloom. Spain carried a unique blend of traditions, shaped by its diverse cultures, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. In Andalusian courts, Arabic poets sang of longing with a richness that influenced European literature for centuries. Their verses were filled with imagery of gardens, nightingales, and stars, evoking love as both sensual and spiritual. In Christian Spain, romances of knights and ladies flourished, yet they often carried a martial edge, reflecting a land shaped by the long wars of the Reconquista. Love and war walked side by side here, with devotion often framed as both passion and loyalty to faith. Spanish traditions remind us that medieval love was not one voice but many, woven from different cultures, sharing the same soil. The Germanic lands developed their own version of troubadour tradition, the minnesingers. These poet-singers celebrated minne, or love, in songs that blended devotion with moral seriousness. Their verses often emphasized distance and longing, portraying love as something unattainable, a force that purified through suffering. The image of the knight serving a distant lady, never hoping for fulfillment, was central to this tradition. German courtship, shaped by these ideals, was filled with restraint, where the nobility of love lay not in possession, but in endurance. This emphasis on longing without reward reflected a culture that valued loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice. Even within these regions, customs varied between city and countryside, between noble and peasant. A nobleman in Florence might write sonnets to a distant lady, while a shepherd in the hills sang a simple tune to his beloved. A French lady in a court might preside over a debate about love, while a village girl in Normandy might receive a garland at a festival. A German knight might compose a minnelied for a lady he could never touch, while a Bavarian peasant carved her name into a wooden cup. The forms differed, but the thread remained the same: the need to express longing, to find ritual for affection, to transform private feeling into something that could be shared, remembered, or endured. We must also remember how these regional traditions influenced one another. Troubadours from France carried their songs into Italy and Spain. Minstrels from Germany travelled through courts, exchanging melodies. Arabic poetry, translated into Latin and vernacular tongues, shaped the very language of European longing. Love, like trade and faith, flowed across borders, carried by poets, priests, merchants, and soldiers. It became a shared language of humanity, each region adding its accent, each culture giving it its own shade of meaning. Picture, then, the vastness of medieval Europe as a mosaic of voices. In one hall, a troubadour sings of unattainable devotion. In another, a German minnesinger describes the pain of longing. In a Florentine study, Dante lifts his eyes to heaven as he writes of Beatrice. In a Spanish courtyard, an Arabic poet weaves verses of stars and nightingales. And in countless villages, ordinary men and women carve tokens, weave garlands, and whisper vows. All are speaking, in their own ways, of the same desire, the yearning to connect, to love, to be loved. Thus, medieval love was never a single story but many, each shaped by place, by language, by custom. And yet across all these differences we see the same human truth, that affection, whether sung in palaces or whispered in fields, whether framed as destiny or duty, was the pulse that bound lives together, giving meaning to days shaped by war, labour and faith. In every corner of the medieval world, love endured, as varied as the lands themselves, yet always familiar, always deeply human. As we reach the final turn of our journey through the winding paths of medieval love, it feels fitting to pause and look back across the 1,000 years we have slowly wandered. We have moved from the troubadour's song in a noble hall to the laughter of peasants at a festival, from the solemn blessings of the church to the secret whispers of forbidden romances. Each step revealed another face of love, tender, dangerous, practical, noble, patient, tragic. It was never one thing but many, always shifting depending on place, class, faith, and circumstance. And yet, through all its variations, one truth remained constant: that human beings, in their quiet and noisy ways alike, sought to give voice to the ache of their hearts. The Middle Ages were not gentle centuries. They were filled with wars, plagues, famine, and rigid hierarchies that bound men and women into roles often not of their choosing. And yet, even in such a world, affection bloomed. It appeared in the tilt of a knight's lance for a lady's honour, in a garland laid at a cottage door, in a letter written by candlelight, in a song carried across valleys by a wandering minstrel. Love did not erase hardship, but it softened it, offered refuge from it, and sometimes even gave it meaning. For a soldier marching to battle, the thought of a beloved's eyes gave courage. For a woman enduring the burdens of household and field, the kindness of a husband's hand, or the smile of a secret admirer offered comfort. Looking across the centuries, we can see how love was shaped by structure, but never fully contained by it. Families arranged marriages, but affection sometimes grew within them nonetheless. The church spoke sternly of sin, yet lovers still found each other in shadows. The law punished transgression, but longing persisted. Ideals of chivalry and poetry raised love to impossible heights. Yet simple gestures of bread shared or buckets carried spoke with equal force. Love resisted boundaries, enduring even when constrained, proving itself as stubborn and enduring as ivy climbing stone walls. It is also here that we find the birth of ideas that still linger with us today. The notion of courtly love, Love as something noble, transformative, elevating, did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It flowed forward into Renaissance poetry, into Shakespeare's sonnets, into the novels and songs of later centuries. The idea that longing itself can be virtuous, that devotion can ennoble, that love is worth suffering for. All these are inheritances from troubadours, minstrels, poets, and the countless unnamed men and women who once whispered in medieval gardens and villages. Even our modern stories of romance, in films, novels, and songs, carry the echoes of medieval halls and festival greens. And yet, perhaps the most enduring lesson of medieval love is its ordinariness. Beneath the glitter of knights and ladies, beneath the verses of poets, most people loved as simply as we do today. They laughed nervously at festivals, they exchanged shy glances at markets, they worried about reputations, they feared rejection, and they hoped for affection returned. Their lives remind us that even in centuries so different from our own, the heart's rhythm was familiar. To be medieval was to be human, and to be human was to long for connection. Picture, one last time, the scenes we have visited. A troubadour strums his lute beneath the vaulted ceiling of a French castle, his words veiled in allegory but burning with passion. A peasant boy carves a wooden comb for the girl he admires, slipping it to her during a midsummer feast. A noblewoman lowers her gaze across a hall, her heart torn between duty and desire. A monk writes of love for God in words that sound almost like longing for a human embrace. A couple, married by arrangement, slowly grows into companionship as the years pass, their affections steady as the seasons. These are fragments, scattered across time, yet together they create a picture, a world alive with love in all its contradictions. And so, our wandering through medieval love comes to a close. We have walked past candlelit halls and muddy lanes, through chapels, gardens, feasts and fields. We have listened to songs and stories, heard the warnings of priests and the laughter of villagers, and traced the threads of affection through law, ritual, and poetry. At every turn, love has shown itself not as one story but as many, a kaleidoscope of yearning, devotion, duty, rebellion, and hope. It is quiet now, the candles burning low, the halls empty, the fields at rest. Yet the echoes remain, the soft strum of a lute, the whispered vow at a betrothal, the laughter of dancers on the green. These are the sounds of love in the Middle Ages, lingering across centuries like the fading notes of a song. They remind us that even in times of hardship and restraint, the human heart found ways to sing, to hope, to reach for another. And that, perhaps, is the most timeless truth of all.